This is episode 107 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Peter Wilson, author of Europe's Tragedy, A History of the 30 Years' War. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
England was a country that was traditionally known as an ale-drinking country. It was brewed with malt, water, and yeast, and it did not have the hops that are crucial to beer production, which draws more alcohol from less grain.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
During the life of William Shakespeare, plain water was often unclean, and filtration, while available, was rudimentary at best. It was not safe to drink the water of the Thames River, and in order to compensate for a general lack of fresh drinking water, the most popular beverage in Elizabethan England, even for regular mealtimes, was beer or ale. Drunkenness was as common of an occurrence as walking around, as was the consistent consumption of large amounts of alcohol. There are court records showing the monarchs of England often celebrated festivals, parties, and visiting dignitaries with the serving of excessive amounts of alcohol, at times amounting to hundreds of barrels of wine, beer, or ale. As one of Shakespeare's most enduring characters, Falstaff is a drunken knight, and even Shakespeare's own death is shrouded in a mystery involving excess drink. With all of this drinking going on in the life of William Shakespeare, what was the opinion and response to drunkenness? Our guest this week, Rebecca Lemon, included an entire chapter on beer and addiction to alcohol in her latest publication titled Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England. Dr. Lemon joins us today to explain some of the most common alcoholic beverages, the state of alcoholism in 16th century England, and what understanding these facts about the cultural relationship to alcohol can tell us about Shakespeare's characters whose personalities were specifically inclusive of drunken behavior, like Falstaff, Prince Hal, and even other characters like Iago, Cassio, and Claudius in Hamlet. Rebecca Lemon is the author of 3 books on Shakespeare, including most recently Shakespeare's King Richard III, Language and Writing from 2018, and Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England, also from 2018. She is the professor of English at the University of Southern California, and her award-winning writing on Shakespeare, law, political philosophy, and the history of medicine has been supported by numerous fellowships. Her work in Addiction and Devotion, which challenges conventional theories of addiction by tracking its longer history from the 16th century, has been featured in a range of venues, from popular radio broadcasts to political blogs to the publications of the American Academy of Religion. Hello, Rebecca. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
In Shakespeare's Othello, Iago says to Cassio, they, meaning the English, are most potent in potting. Your Dane, your German, and your swag-bellied Hollander, drink ho, are nothing to your English. Potting here refers to alcoholic drinking, and this quote suggests that heavy drinking was a mainstay of English culture in Shakespeare's lifetime. Yet at this same moment in history, we see England passing drinking laws. Rebecca, what were some of these laws about heavy drinking, and how effective might they have been at managing public drunkenness?
Well, in terms of the laws, it's a complex story. So for most of Elizabeth's reign, there was no national law against drunkenness. There wasn't the equivalent of a drunk and disorderly charge. Instead, justices of the peace were meant to regulate, quote, inordinate haunting and tippling of inns and alehouses. And there was a heavy fine associated with essentially hanging out too long at the alehouse. It would be 3 to 4 shillings for the first offense, which is like $100, and 8 to 10 shillings for the second, which is upwards of $2,000. But these regulations of haunting and tippling were not enough for the Puritans or the godly who perceived drunkenness to be a sin and were more and more interested in regulating it. So they had all manner of efforts to do this. One is they published a number of pamphlets with alarming woodcuts of people dying of alcohol consumption, but they also tried very hard to get legislation passed through Parliament as their numbers increased, right? So as the 1580s and over the course of the 1590s, more Puritans made it into Parliament, and they began to pass or attempted to pass bills into acts on drunkenness. Generally, their bills were hissed when they were read aloud on the floor of the Parliament. So laws trying to regulate drunkenness and tavern attendance got a lot of pushback from more high church Protestants who saw it as an attack on traditional English pastimes. So it basically took 20 years before a national drunkenness statute finally passed under King James in 1606, which was just before the appearance of Othello. So that reference in Othello is especially timely to a kind of interest in and regulation of drunkenness.
Well, what about the rivalry Iago is referring to here with the Germans, the Danes, and apparent skill of the English at drinking? You alluded to this with your reference of the laws themselves being viewed as an assault on English pastimes. Was there this kind of national rivalry around heavy drinking?
Absolutely. So it's one of the kind of interesting and timely questions for Shakespeare and his contemporaries is a kind of rivalry with particularly the Dutch and the Germans. There's a whole national conversation around comparative drinking strength that appears in popular pamphlets where you have folks like Iago kind of celebrating English drinking prowess, but you equally have writers of quite different stripes. You have Puritans like William Prynne, but you also have satirists like Thomas Nash who condemn the way that the English have allegedly picked up Dutch drinking habits during the Low Country Wars. So when English soldiers went to help the Dutch in their wars against Spain, they came back with new modes of drinking. And these modes of drinking were then condemned by some and celebrated by others. And England was a country that was traditionally known as an ale drinking country. It was brewed with malt, water, and yeast, and it did not have the hops that are crucial to beer production, which draws more alcohol from less grain. So the English were associated with this lower alcohol content ale, but the Dutch and the Germans were beer brewers. So it means that there is then also a rivalry when it comes to ale versus beer and England versus their foreign rivals, particularly as more and more English folks begin to introduce kind of beer production into England.
Queen Elizabeth so loved the character of Falstaff, who I definitely think of and associating drinking of ale, that she specifically requested Shakespeare write a play in which Falstaff falls in love. For Protestants, as Elizabeth was, drunkenness is held as a sin, and you referred to this with the Puritans. But the beloved status that she gave Falstaff seems to indicate a tolerance for a certain level of drunkenness. Why was Elizabeth not incensed at his immoral proclivities and quite instead the complete opposite?
The Puritans were that Protestant faction that really perceived drunkenness to be a sin. For somebody who was a more of a middle of the road Protestant like Elizabeth, certain kinds of ritual and festivity were acceptable and traditional. So things like tavern going on the weekend or church fundraisers called Whitsun ales. These were okay practices and in fact even desirable. The tavern or the alehouse was a place where people met in the community. So it means that Elizabeth might not have condemned outright certain kinds of alcohol-fueled festivity, especially because particularly ale consumption was part of a daily diet. People needed to drink ale for calories, for cleaner water. What we do know about Elizabeth, though, and this really gets at your question, is that she did not like the practice of binge drinking. There was a notorious practice called health drinking, which is actually what they're doing in that scene from Othello that you quote above. And it's also what Claudius does in Hamlet. And it's what Lepidus, Antony, and Octavius Caesar do in Antony and Cleopatra, as well as Toby Belch in Twelfth Night. So Shakespeare has a bunch of characters that engage in something called health drinking, which sounds wonderful, right? It's like some healthy beverage, but it isn't. It actually is a practice of toasting your companions by saying to your health, and then you would drain the contents of your entire glass. That was one way of doing it. So if there were 8 of you drinking and you each had to offer a toast, you would then be downing 8 glasses of liquor. And it was a way of getting very drunk pretty quickly with a group of friends or tavern companions. This is something we know Elizabeth didn't like because she has a quip to some courtier who was toasting her health. And she says, I'm always ill when people are toasting my health. And so in that sense, we might think of her kind of like Olivia, who has Sir Toby drinking and reveling in her household, but who would really prefer things to be a little bit more moderated. Imagine, okay, this story may be apocryphal, but it's so beloved that people do imagine, she said, please write me a play about Falstaff in love. And that play is then Merry Wives of Windsor. So how did she square his heavy drinking? This is how I think about it. The Falstaff that I think she might have fallen in love with in Henry IV, Part 1, is not simply about drinking, even though he's in the boar's head and he loves sack. He's also about community and friendship and the kind of world of the tavern, theater, words, wittiness. The Falstaff of Henry IV, Part 2 is quite a different character. He's kind of darker. We might say his addiction is more troublesome. But initially, I think the character that Elizabeth had such affection for is one who marries alcohol consumption with community and friendship. And I think that's what drew her in.
As you say, Falstaff's most famous drink is called sack, and he gives this beverage credit for his own wit. What exactly is sack, though, Rebecca? I mean, obviously, we're not talking green smoothies here, even though they're drinking it for their health. What is he downing in such quantities?
Yeah. So sack comes from the word sec or dry, and it describes a dry, fortified white wine. It has quite a high alcohol content because sugar was often added to it. And it was imported from the Canary Islands. That's why Falstaff calls it canary as well as sack. The phrase that Falstaff uses, sherris sack, eventually becomes condensed to simply sherry. So what we might say now is it's a dry white wine sherry.
Falstaff is considered disreputable and an outcast socially, but his choice of sack as a drink seems to be intentional when compared with Christopher Sly in Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, who refuses sack and demands instead a pot of ale, saying, "Call me not honor nor lordship, I never drank sack in my life." Was sack specifically an upper class drink?
Yes, absolutely. There was a significant class divide when it came to alcohol.
So why in the world is he giving it to Falstaff?
Falstaff's station in the play is a perplexing one, we might say. He is a knight. He's put in charge of gathering a regiment. He has some claim to a station at court, not just through Hal, but because he is known by all of the various king's officers in those plays. So even if in the context of the play, he codes as not as high ranking as some of his companions, especially Hal, he nevertheless he's a gentleman. And more than that, he is aspirational. So drinking sack might be one important way for him ensuring that he codes as a gentleman and a courtier. And kind of more, in a more pedestrian way, sack is a lot higher alcohol content than ale. So it's a more efficient beverage for somebody who really likes to imbibe and get drunk. I would like to say something about the Christopher Sly reference, because there's something, I think, kind of heartwarming about his desire for the pot of ale above sack.
I wondered if it was something that you mentioned earlier about that being almost a patriotic statement of his.
Yes, I think that on one level you could say it is a kind of English. I want an English drink. I don't want a foreign beverage that I've never had in my life. And I think knowing that sack and wine are these elite beverages, part of the tension in this scene is this gentleman who's playing a trick on Christopher Sly, suggesting to him, of course, because you're a gentleman. So if you remember in the play, this gentleman, this lord, kind of captures the drunken Christopher Sly, dresses him up, ensconces him in a house where he's surrounded by servants. And when Sly wakes up, suggests to him that he's the owner of this house, these servants are his, and of course he's a sack drinker because here he is, this upper class gentry figure. And I think that Sly's insistence that he likes pots of ale to Shakespeare's audience, who probably themselves were drinking pots of ale as they were watching the show, would produce a kind of rousing cry of, yes, you stick to your guns, Christopher Sly, and drink your ale. Particularly because it's a way of kind of pushing back on the trick that I think is a bit mean-spirited by this lord. And Sly is saying, look, you can dress me up all you want, but I know what taste I have. I know what I like. And I like English ale. Thank you very much.
As audience members were watching Falstaff on stage for his plays, they would have had beer and ale to drink themselves there at the Globe, at least, as foods and drinks were to playhouses like popcorn and Coke is to movie theaters today. Do you think the audience would have applauded Falstaff when he declared that all humans should, quote, addict themselves to sack?
Absolutely. I can well imagine people raising their glasses and then kind of toasting him and downing their beverage. So one of the fun bits of research that's been done recently includes excavating the ground of London playhouses. So among them, the Curtain Playhouse, which is being kind of cataloged in its excavations and then rebuilt. In the process, scholars, including archaeologists and Shakespeare specialists, have been able to test the soil and discover what kinds of snacks people would be eating. So what it means is that when Falstaff is tucking into his tavern fare, including the 2 gallons of sack, the anchovies, bread, the capon, which is a kind of rooster that was popular in Elizabethan England, we would know that the audience was eating oysters, crabs, mussels, and cockles, walnuts, hazelnuts, plums, cherries, peaches, dried raisins, and figs. So it's like the popcorn and Coke of today, except it's taken up a notch.
Yeah, I certainly don't have a dinner of oyster and crabs when I go to the theater.
Yeah, exactly. I don't either. Yeah, and then I'll have more to say about the fact that indeed they were drinking. They were drinking and eating while they were watching the show.
Rebecca's research indicates one playgoer actually recorded what he ate at the playhouse. A Thomas Platter in 1599 wrote about visiting a playhouse, and he says, quote, "And during the performance, food and drink are carried round the audience so that for one cares to pay, one may also have refreshment." Rebecca, this sounds a lot more like a ballpark atmosphere than a theater. Does this mean that someone was actually carrying food and drink around the playhouse to sell it to patrons while the performance was happening on stage?
I love the idea of the theater as a ballpark because...
Right? Oh, I so do too.
Yeah. It's because it's so appropriate. First of all, because kind of like any ballpark stadium, there were tap rooms on site at the theaters. And you had servers who might come around to sell and deliver the food or drink, or you might have patrons getting up to go buy their drink. And furthermore, the ballpark comment is so on point because... nowadays, and I love this, many of us get to enjoy a Shakespeare performance inside of a darkened theater where there is a real ability to focus kind of single-pointedly on the performance. But the reality of performance in Elizabethan England was so much different. There wasn't a presumption of a kind of fourth wall in which the audience sits in a darkened, quiet space. The theater was outside. The audience surrounded the stage. It was daylight, so everybody could see each other. And there was real mobility, people getting up and down, noise, interaction with the crowd. So it means it was a huge popular event that packed in people of all different types and classes for a day of enjoyment, refreshment, revelry, all the things that I think we do associate now with going to the ballpark and that many of us get when we go to Shakespeare in the Park with a picnic, which I love.
Shakespeare doesn't only reference real drinks that Elizabethans were having and enjoying as part of their theater experience, but he also calls in to play real bars and taverns, one of which is the Eastcheap, known as the Boar's Head Inn or Tavern. This is the site where Falstaff incurs a rather large bar bill. And some of the taverns in England were actually performance spaces during Shakespeare's lifetime, before and alongside the advent of purpose-built theaters. Rebecca, was the Boar's Head Inn one of these places?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's one of the earliest. So near the Curtain Theatre, where Shakespeare first launched Henry IV, Part 1, there was, in fact, a tavern called the Boar's Head Inn. It was supposedly built in 1537. And the fact we call it, in talking about it, the Boar's Head Tavern or the Boar's Head Inn, these are different spaces. So it was actually an inn, which is important because an inn was a structure with a central courtyard and balconies for spectators. It was a place where people would spend the night as well as take a meal and have a drink. So it meant that these inns were good places for early performances. And in fact, some scholars even argue that the subsequent public playhouses like the Curtain or the Theatre or the Globe were built in a structure that mimicked that of an inn, because that was really where the first kind of static plays in a physical design space happened. A tavern, by contrast, which is what we sometimes might say Boar's Head Tavern, was a place where people would meet to drink and potentially eat a meal, and it would have different rooms in it. But it was not a place like an inn that had a big performance space courtyard, because it was not a place where people would generally spend the night. It wasn't like a hotel.
So aside from the Boar's Head Inn, what were some of the other locations in 16th century England where performances would have happened at an inn?
So there were 6 main inns in Elizabethan London that served as venues for playing. The Boar's Head Inn, which we just discussed and is one of the earlier ones. There was also the Bull Inn, the Bell Inn, the Saracen Head Inn, the Cross Keys Inn, and the Bell Savage, which was near Ludgate Hill. And this last inn is famous because it's here that allegedly a performance of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus resulted in the conjuring of one too many devils.
The play conjured devils?
Yes, this is a fantastic story. So in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, which is a fairly early play in the history of the public playhouses, there's a conjuration scene in which the title character, Dr. Faustus, surrounds himself with kind of anagrammatized symbols and calls up a devil, Mephistopheles, who then aids him from the rest of the play. But according to lore, the performance that occurred at the Bell Savage resulted in conjuring an extra devil. So the phrase that we hear is one too many devils, and the audience freaked out because, of course, does the devil pay attention to the quotation marks of theater? If you're attempting to conjure the devil, does he understand that, oh, this is just a theatrical performance, so I shouldn't come? I think it's a really fascinating question about the power of theater and what it is that Marlowe is doing in that particular play, which is literally calling up Mephistopheles from hell. And the idea that it was successful, that the play actually did call up a devil, was really haunting and part of the play's lore. And it began at the Bell Savage, this inn near Ludgate Hill.
Well, that did absolutely nothing to help the combating of the Puritans' opinion that going to the theater was dangerous for your health.
Precisely.
In Henry IV, Part 2, Edward Pwands is talking to a page about the page blushing with regards to a pottle pot. The page uses the expression red lattice to describe the location of a, quote, alewife, with the line saying, quote, "It calls me even now, my lord, through a red lattice, and could discern no part of his face from the window. At last I spied his eyes, and methought he had made 2 holes in the alewife's new petticoat, and so peeped through." Rebecca, some of these references are what could solidly be described as unsavory, but please help us understand what's happening in this conversation from a historical context. What is a pottle pot, and isn't red lattice a term to describe the 16th century version of a speakeasy?
All right, the description of Poins is quite layered. One of the things it tells us is, just as you say, he's in a version of a speakeasy. He's in an unlicensed ale house, a kind of underground, affordable place to drink that contrasts dramatically with the Boar's Head Inn. Okay, so I just suggested that we have multiple servers, multiple rooms in a place like an inn. It's where the wealthy and middling sort of patrons would go to enjoy their beverages, maybe have some food. Less well-to-do patrons might instead visit an ale house. An ale house is a place that generally does not serve food. It has snacks. And an even cheaper version would be the unlicensed ale house. This would not have a sign, obviously, because like a speakeasy, it was unlicensed, but there would be a broom outside or a red lattice in the window. They were unregulated, unlicensed. So it meant Poins is in a place that is kind of edgy, that is very local, and that is, generally speaking, inexpensive. What this description also tells us is that Poins is very intimate with the alewife. Now, we can certainly have kind of drinking servers who are sexualized, but alewives were also people who came in for a lot of satirical, misogynistic critique. So the alewife herself was a kind of vexed figure. An alewife could be a waitress, but she could also be, like, I guess we would say now, bartender. And further, she may even, in the tradition of England, be the person who is brewing the ale herself. These women were called brewsters. So some unlicensed alehouses might be run by a woman who is actually brewing the ale that she is then selling. So the alewife could be the business owner. She could be the employee. That's why, like any category of woman who has a kind of potential self-sufficiency, she comes in for critical attack. So she has a capacious number of jobs, one might say.
So looking at all the different kinds of places where a person in 16th century England could go to get alcohol or a meal or a gathering place, professionally, it seems taverns functioned as a place of networking for 16th century theater industry, including a famous gathering at the Mermaid Tavern for this purpose, set up by Ben Jonson. Rebecca, what is this gathering Jonson orchestrated, and why was it at a tavern? Would Shakespeare have been at a meeting like this?
Because the tavern is a place where you could get a meal. It was a place that served drink, and it was also a place with different rooms. This is true of certain, British taverns still. So the Mermaid Tavern had a room, the Apollo Room, and this is where Ben Jonson brought together a gathering of different writers and poets in what he called the fraternity of sirenical gentlemen, sirens, kind of people who hear the siren song of poetry. And it was a drinking club that met on the first Friday of every month. We have evidence that Ben Jonson, John Donne, John Fletcher, Francis Beaumont, and others may have gathered there. There's also a tradition of suggesting that Shakespeare might have gone and exchanged kind of barbs and jest in the rivalry he had with Jonson.
I certainly hope that that was true, because it's just such a powerhouse of people all in one room together. It's very fun to think that Shakespeare might have been there. Overall, this topic is just full of things that we could explore at no end, I'm sure. And I know we would love to learn more and explore this further. What are some of your favorite books or resources that you might recommend we use when we want to explore this topic more?
Well, I mentioned the Brewster, and I highly recommend Judith M. Bennett's Ale, Beer, and Brewsters in England, Woman's Work in a Changing World. It's a book that talks about brewsters and the tradition of kind of ale versus beer and women's role in the beer industry or ale industry. I also recommend Peter Clarke's The English Ale House, A Social History. It's a long-standing kind of classic in the field of telling the story of the ale house. I can't help but mention my own book, Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England, where I talk about drinking and some of the drinking laws, as well as other addictive activities like work and love of God. Adam Smythe has a wonderful edited collection called A Pleasing Sin, Drink and Conviviality in 17th Century England. That is another one of my favorites. It has lots of different essays, including one by Charles Luddington that talks about the kind of class associations with drinking. So those would be some of my suggestions.
Those are excellent resources. We will link to those in today's show notes for this episode. Rebecca herself has published extensively on this topic, and I will be linking to her works. The one we are discussing today is mostly the one called Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England, but we've touched on several. So make sure you check out the show notes to find links to her work as well as the ones she recommends. Rebecca, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
I found this question a little harder to answer than I might have imagined. And then I found my answer, and I'm so thrilled with it, I'm surprised it didn't come to me right away, which is I would take a complete set of the Oxford English Dictionary with me.
Oh, well chosen.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, though, since the second edition is 20 volumes, it seems like a little bit of a cheat to take it. So I would actually, I realized just technically, I'd have to take the compact edition with the magnifying glass. And I just be really careful not to lose the magnifying glass or break my glasses.
Or
when
burn
I'm
the pages,
while I'm on the deserted island. Exactly, with a blazing sun. So it's like, there's going to be some problems, but I really would want the Oxford English Dictionary. That would be my choice.
Well, you'd be well set up on your deserted island with that choice for sure. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I was a little more excited about this topic than I am right now, and you'll understand why in a second. I'm working on a book about states of emergency in Shakespeare, and I've been working on it for about a year or so, with chapters on plague, climate change, food supply challenges. And so I hardly expected that it would be as timely as it is right now. But it has not really dampened my enthusiasm for the project. It really needs to happen and it needs to be written. But it's hard to be writing and researching on states of emergency when we're actually living in a state of emergency.
It brings a lot more emotion to the project, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Well, that's a very exciting topic. I know we'll be looking forward to seeing that come to fruition. I hope you'll stay in touch and let us know when we can read it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Rebecca Lemon, thank you so much for being here today to walk us through beer and addiction in 16th century England. This has been a fun conversation.
It's been a really fun conversation.
This topic is so exciting. If you want to dive in and explore further some of the links to the Bell Inn and the Curtain, as well as the Bell Savage, all of the history of these places and their history as performance spaces, as well as the laws on Elizabethan England and drunkenness and ale versus sack. There's so much packed into the show notes this week, and you can find all of it at CassidyCash.com/episode 107. That's CassidyCash.com/EP107. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right. That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available. And not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.